The days all blur together now. I move through them like I'm drifting underwater, slow and silent, everything muffled. It's been like this for years, but recently the weight of it has become harder to ignore. Calder's work has eaten away whatever was left between us, any tiny fragments of warmth or affection long since dissolved by routines, shallow pleasantries, or, more often, complete silence. His shallow good nights, when he even has time to come home, are a formality at best. He spends more and more time buried in contracts and meetings, sometimes disappearing for entire weeks on business trips. The house is like a mausoleum when he's gone. His empty chair at the dining table, the cold side of the bed reminding me of how distant he's always been, even when his body was next to mine. It's strange, when we lie there in the same room, with only the space between us, that I feel lonelier lying next to him than I do when he's away. The mornings start the same. I rise early, make the bed he hasn't touched, brew coffee for a husband who won't be drinking it, and move through the rhythm of housework that serves no purpose beyond keeping my hands busy. The walls watch me, echoing with silence. I've thought about redecorating, maybe putting up new curtains or a fresh coat of paint, but what would be the point? It's not like anyone's here to notice. Not Calder, certainly not Cale, who, despite living nearby, feels as distant to me as his father. Every night I lie there alone, staring into the dark, and something inside me aches. It's an emptiness I've grown used to acknowledging, but not confronting. The other day, I was out for groceries. Just one of those errands people do without thinking. Autumn had come in steady waves of cold air, the trees shedding their leaves in great bursts of color. Normally that's something I would have found lovely, but that day I was distracted, moving through the motions without ever being present. Maybe that's why I missed the signs. The sputter, then the thud as the car whined to a stop. Fan belt? Spark plugs? I don't know shit about cars beyond the basics, and to be honest, it was the last thing I needed that day. My phone, like the car, decided to give up on me almost immediately. No signal, the downside of driving along some back road trying to avoid the heavier traffic near the market. Calder crossed my mind for the briefest moment, but even imagining his response made me hesitate. He wouldn't understand why I was frustrated. He'd simply react with that cool, distant tone of his, as if he were already annoyed at the inconvenience of it all. I could hear his voice in my head, mild impatience feathered into every word. So, no. No Calder. That's when KL came to mind. I don't know why it took me so long to think of him. It should have been obvious. He's a mechanic, after all. I hovered over his number for longer than I'd admit, though. It felt weird, calling him out of the blue. We were never particularly close, not that we ever fought or had any major disagreements, but there was a distance, an unspoken politeness that had formed over the years. I was his father's wife, not much more. Still, there was no other option, so I made the call. Cale answered quickly, surprising, given how busy his garage usually was, and agreed to head over. There wasn't much conversation, just quick logistics. Location, the problem, all delivered efficiently. Professional, like a business deal. When I finally saw the outline of his truck, relief flooded through me in a way I didn't expect. The sight of another living, breathing person tugged at something deep, shaking me out of the haze I'd been drifting in. His truck came down the gravel like a storm rolling in, kicking up clouds behind it. Cale slid out of the driver's seat, with the kind of relaxed confidence that only comes from someone comfortable in their own skin. He had his sleeves rolled up, a dark green shirt clinging to his forearms, hands calloused, used to machinery, to fixing things. Him standing there was a reminder of how different he was from Calder. "Ha, trouble you, Lizzie." There was something almost playful in the way he said my name, a mix of teasing and familiarity that threw me just a little off balance. You'd think, after all these years, I'd be used to him, used to his natural charm. But something about that grin, easy and unforced, caught me off guard. He bent over the hood, rolling back the sleeves further and leaning in. I stood nearby, crossing my arms as the wind tugged at my jacket, watching silently from the side as he got to work. From where I stood, Cale looked different. Not in a way that I'd just noticed, but in a way where I understood that time had shifted things without me seeing them happen. I hadn't really looked at him in so long. I realized then just how much time had passed since he'd come into my life. Somewhere along the way, the awkward young man I had initially met had turned into someone much more assured. His movements were economical, every action precise. He consulted the engine with easy familiarity, as if they were old friends catching up. Something about how deliberate his actions were steadied me. I hadn't noticed just how much I'd been carrying until I felt the weight lift, just a little, watching him work. When he paused for a moment and our eyes met, I couldn't explain the flicker of tension that ran between us. Maybe it was just that unspoken understanding that families never talk about, not fully belonging, but showing up when it counts. There was something in the way Cale's gaze softened, a wordless connection that felt significant in the moment, like it ran deeper than I'd anticipated. I looked away quickly, feeling the strange flutter in my chest, uncertain of what it meant, or if it even meant anything at all, focusing again on the busted engine and the task at hand. "A little overdue on maintenance," Cale's voice pierced the quiet with another playful jab, but this time his tone wasn't teasing, it was warm. Steam rose from under the hood of my car as Cale examined the issue. His skilled hands moved with practiced efficiency while he explained the coolant leak. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his features, highlighting how much he'd grown from the reserved teenager I first met years ago. "I'll need to tow it to the shop. Let me give you a ride home." The offer caught me off guard, but with no other options, I accepted. In his truck, the leather seats carried the scent of motor oil and something distinctly masculine. The radio played softly in the background as we pulled away from the breakdown spot. "Remember that time Dad tried to fix the dishwasher himself?" Cale's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Flooded the entire kitchen." The memory sparked a laugh from deep within me. "God, yes." Calder standing there, completely soaked, insisting he had it under control, while you and I snuck out to call a plumber. For the first time in what felt like years, I found myself truly laughing. The tension I usually carried melted away as Cale shared more stories, each one drawing out genuine smiles and comfortable conversation. The ride felt too short when we finally pulled into my driveway. The engine idled as Cale turned to face me. The warmth in his green eyes caught me off guard, stirring something I hadn't felt in ages. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate," he said softly, his words carrying a weight that made my breath catch. I managed a nod, lingering in the moment before stepping out. Through the rearview mirror, I watched him drive away, my heart beating just a little faster than usual. The next day, I drove to his garage in my borrowed neighbor's car. The industrial building smelled of grease and metal, a sharp contrast to my sanitized home environment. Between the lifts and tool chests, Cale's workspace felt alive, lived in. He worked on my car while we talked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Our conversations started with simple things: the weather, local gossip, harmless topics. But something shifted as the afternoon wore on. "I always wanted to travel," I found myself saying, surprising myself with the admission. Before I met your father, I had plans to see Europe, to write. Funny how life takes different turns. Cale stopped working, giving me his full attention. Something about his quiet focus made the words flow easier. I told him about my dreams of becoming a writer, my failed first marriage, things I'd kept bottled up for years. Outside, thunder rumbled as storm clouds gathered. The fluorescent lights cast shadows across his face as he listened, really listened, in a way no one had in years. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, matching the brewing storm outside. A strand of hair fell across my face as I looked down, fidgeting with my purse strap. Cale stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush the lock away. His fingers grazed my cheek, sending an electric current through my entire body. I couldn't help the slight shiver that ran through me at his touch. He stepped back quickly, oil-stained hands dropping to his sides. "Sorry," he muttered, but the damage was done. The atmosphere had shifted irreversibly, charged with something dangerous and thrilling. I've been back to Cale's garage twice since that night. Both times I had a perfectly valid excuse, something about the car. Just small things, little annoyances that I insisted needed attention. Each visit felt more desperate than the last, though I'd never admit that out loud, not even to myself. Today, it's the brakes. Or so I say. They're squeaking, though, honestly, I barely hear it. But I told Calder about it this morning, acting like it was some sort of emergency. Of course, he barely looked up from his paper. Just said, "Call Cale." So I did, and now I'm here again, breathing in the smell of oil and metal that clings to every inch of the place. Cale's bent over the hood of another car when I arrive. He wipes his hands on a rag as he steps toward me. "You're becoming a regular around here." There is a warmth in his voice, but it's different than before. It makes my pulse stumble, that remark, and whatever game I've been playing, pretending this is just about cars, feels paper thin. The silence between us stretches long enough that the truth, all the weight of it, nearly spills out. I falter, and my voice sounds too tight even to my own ears. His gaze holds mine, steady. There's something between us, raw and unspoken, simmering too close to the surface. I can feel it. He takes a step forward, and there's no pretending now. He's close enough that I can see his chest rising, the barest tremor of his fingers as they reach up, not for the car this time, but for me. I try to breathe normally, but it's like something inside me has caught fire. His hand pauses, just for a second, like he's waiting for me to stop him. I don't. His lips find mine, tentative at first, like we're both testing the water, testing the boundary that's already been shattered the moment my mouth meets his. It isn't slow for long. There's this heat that pulses in the air. Years of unsaid things, of lingering looks, stretching every second of contact. His hands slide up, cradling my face, and I find myself pulling him closer, that ache inside me unwinding in a way it's never done with Calder. All the yearning I've buried, the fragments of dreams that I never let myself touch, it's all there, flooding through me as though I'd been locked in a dark room and someone just ripped open the door. Then, too fast, he pulled back, and the cold air rushes in where his warmth had been. "What?" I gasp, trying to gather myself, trying to be someone who hasn't just crossed a line I can't uncross. But that's when the guilt crashes in, so fast and fierce that it nearly knocks me over. Reality snaps back into focus, the smell of the garage, the faint whir of a drill somewhere in the back, the ridiculous pretense of my brake issue hanging between us like a cracked lie. It had become a dance I couldn't escape from, even though I knew I was tiptoeing over shards of my own life, threatening to shatter everything I thought I'd built. The excuses were getting thinner, more fragile, like tracing paper. Today it was that ridiculous ticking sound the car had been making. My voice on the phone had been carefully casual, too casual for Cale not to notice something strange beneath it. He must have known. His silences had started to say more than his words. But he let it slide anyway, like he always did. When I pulled up to the garage, the sky was already bleeding into dusk, lilacs and slate grays trailing behind me as another day folded under the weight of my own restlessness. The hum of Cale's tools echoed from inside the open door, streaks of fluorescent light cutting through the shadows. I stepped out, legs feeling heavier than before, knowing this nonsense about the car wasn't fooling either of us anymore. He was leaning against his workbench when I walked in, grease-stained rag in his hands. I could tell from the way he didn't immediately turn around that he was bracing himself. We'd been caught in this spiral for weeks now, neither of us strong enough, or perhaps willing, to stop it. "So, what's it this time?" His voice was thick with a kind of restrained amusement, though there was an edge of something else. Wariness, maybe. I shuffled in place, pretending to inspect something on my coat. "There's this ticking," I murmured. Even to my own ears, it sounded ridiculous. He didn't move, didn't make a show of doubting me, but his eyes slid toward me, and I saw right through him. He was standing there, calling my bluff, without having to say a damn thing. The heavy tension swallowed the space between us again. It was happening more frequently, the silences. We had once filled them with small talk, laughs that felt stolen from a place we shouldn't have been visiting. But tonight, there was no pretending, no easy conversations waiting around the corner. I watched him set the rag down, finally straightening himself and moving in my direction, his eyes holding mine in that way that always left me breathless. Something in me was nagging, pulling at the edges of my consciousness, telling me to find an exit, but my feet remained rooted to the damp floor beneath me. As he inched closer, I could almost hear the faint clink of our excuses crumbling to pieces. He stopped right in front of me, the scent of oil, metal, and something undeniably him filling the small space between us. Heat radiated from him, a sun I'd been orbiting dangerously close to for too long now. "Are we just gonna keep doing this?" His voice was low, rough, and somehow soft all at once. It wasn't a question, so much as it was a pointed remark, a reminder of the game we'd begun but couldn't name. I tried to respond, but the words caught. I focused on my breath, urging it to remain steady. But when he leaned in, that plan was thrown straight out the window. His hand found my jaw, tentative at first, giving me a moment, as if this wasn't inevitable. His thumb traced the line of my cheek, and then he was kissing me, lightly at first, testing again whether I'd pull away, like I ever would. Everything felt sharper, more urgent than the last time. Maybe that was because we both knew how wrong this truly was by now, and yet, still, we let ourselves fall into the goddamn abyss. His lips parted mine, deepening the kiss, drawing out something raw within us, something we'd been taming far too long. I forgot about everything, about Calder, the guilt that usually gnawed at me. Hell, I forgot where the hell I was. It was only us, the sound of our breathing, the press of his body against mine, the heat that tore through all logic. My hands found the back of his neck, fingers curling into his hair, an automatic reflex at this point. We kept going, the moments stretching on, a blur where time lost meaning, lost any hold. But reality has a way of bursting in like an unwanted guest that hasn't got the hint yet. The weight of it all suddenly dropped on me hard, like someone had slammed a door inside my skull, and I stumbled backward, breaking the kiss with a sharp breath. The words were a jumble in my throat, my pulse was drumming in my ears, a heartbeat so loud it seemed like the whole garage must have heard it too. I hadn't even finished the thought before I bolted for the door like some cheap character in a bad romance novel, which is fitting considering the mess I was crafting here. I barely looked back, though I knew he was watching me, probably still standing in that same spot, unsure whether to follow or let me run. My chest was tight as I slammed the car doors shut, my hand shaking on the steering wheel. I stared straight ahead for what felt like an eternity before I even remembered that the car still needed fixing. Ironically enough, that moment was about everything but. A few days passed. Maybe a week, I don't know. Time had blurred into this fog, thickened by guilt and whatever the hell this was, with Cale growing into more than just a distraction. Every day, I thought I wouldn't go back, that I could just stop. But each time I found myself crossing town, drawn back to that damned garage, like some magnet I had no control over. The more we met, the more it felt like a release. With Cale, I wasn't the woman holding together an empty shell of a marriage, wasn't the polite, measured stepmother walking on eggshells. With him, I could breathe, keep things light when everything else in my life was so unbearably heavy. We'd laugh, talk about nothing, then kiss all the air out of the room. We'd drown out our own thoughts like that for hours. But then, he began asking the questions. The ones hovering between us like waiting shadows. What happens if Calder finds out? It was inevitable. I blinked, not wanting to answer. I didn't have an answer, and yet my laugh came quick, light, brushing it off. We're just fine for now, I said. But God, it sounded flimsy even to me. I knew he saw through that paper-thin attempt at reassurance. The weight of it was the kind you couldn't avoid forever. Calder came back from his last Bursines trip with a newfound energy, like he'd taken on some self-appointed mission to fix us. It felt like walking into an old memory. The Calder who used to pay attention, who'd schedule reservations and actually ask how I was. He invited me to places we hadn't been in years, even suggesting we go away for a weekend, just the two of us. I should have been thrilled, I guess, but each gesture only made my chest tighten more. It wasn't him anymore. It was all rehearsed, like he'd read about it. Some checklist for reconnecting with your wife crammed into his planner. When he asked about my day, I found myself fumbling with the simplest details. What had I done? Or more accurately, what had I not done? I couldn't even trace the hours properly, the time with Cale bleeding into every other moment, consuming my thoughts until the timeline of my life seemed... Guilt twisted in my gut whenever Calder smiled at me. There was a way he'd look at me now, eyes locked in, like he was trying to decipher some hidden code, unravel whatever I'd buried beneath my skin. It made staying in the same room with him unbearable. Every little silence vibrated with something unsaid. He didn't know, did he? No, he couldn't. Still, I felt like a prisoner within those four walls, tied down by the weight of unspoken words and hidden touches. I hadn't seen Cale in a week, the longest stretch in months, and the distance ached in me, tugged at me like a physical need. Then Cressida showed up, unannounced, as always, just like her, to barge in at the least convenient moment, tea in hand, and that razor-sharp gaze of hers, feeling out every little crack. We sat in the living room, Calder conveniently off in his office again, and she wasted no time. Her questions started innocent enough, the usual back and forth about his work trips, but then her eyes narrowed slightly, as though she sensed something more. "You've been looking radiant lately," she said, tapping her nails casually along the rim of her cup. It took everything in me not to flinch, but I felt my back stiffen all the same. She smiled, but behind that smile, there was something sharper, something probing. I could barely choke out a polite response before she kept going, sliding right into the next thing with that unnatural ease she carried herself with. I ran into Calder at that charity event last month. You missed it, didn't you? Shame. I shrugged, hoping she wouldn't press there either, but of course she did. He was speaking with a rather striking brunette, Cressida said, her voice light, almost dismissive. They were deep in conversation, and he seemed, well, rather engaged. My breath caught, my mind racing through what that could mean. What had he been doing, and was it even true? It's Cressida. Stirring the pot wasn't just her style, it was her hobby. Still, something about her tone left me shaken. I tried to brush it off, forcing a smile. Calder's always engaged in business, was my pathetic attempt to deflect. But even before the words came out, I could feel the weight of my own unraveling. It started with Calder's sudden invitation to take me out to dinner. I didn't expect it. Calder wasn't the type to initiate these things unless there was something deeper brewing. But something in his tone that evening, controlled and careful, made me agree without much thought. Maybe guilt. Maybe hope that we could salvage what had been fraying for so long. He chose the restaurant, of course. It was in one of those skyscraper hotels downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting, jazz drifting softly in the background, and immaculate white tablecloths that never carried a crease. The waiters moved like apparitions, hovering without a word, and each course came with some elaborate explanation I barely caught. Calder, though, seemed to be in his element. I sat across from him, watching his movements. There was something almost mechanical in the way he leaned over the menu, inquired about the wine, and nodded with that familiar stoic approval. It was all so effortless, like he'd practiced these motions 100 times before. Still, when he looked at me, actually looked, I saw that unreadable glint in his eyes again, the one I could never fully interpret. His smile was pleasant, generous even, but felt foreign, a performance. All shine, no substance. Maybe that was how our marriage had always been, appearance over intimacy. There was once a time when I blamed myself for not trying harder, but I wasn't sure of anything anymore. Even now, sitting across from him, I felt a cold distance between us, as though we were merely actors playing out some final scene. About halfway through the main course, I remember putting my glass down and almost voicing something real, asking him, demanding what was going on between us. Why now? Why this sudden effort? But that sliver of courage dissolved the moment someone approached our table. She glided up, too, casually, like she'd been invited, like she belonged there. The first thing I noticed about Seraphine was the way her honey-blonde hair seemed to catch the low light, making her all the more luminous. Her eyes were soft but sharp, mapping out every inch of the table. Instinct told me to look at Calder, even before she spoke. "Alicia," Calder said, in that smooth, unruffled way that took me back years, back when I still thought his calm demeanor was comforting. "This is Seraphine, one of my business associates." There was nothing businesslike about the way his hand rested on her lower back. Nothing professional in the way her body curved instinctively towards him, like two parts of a whole. Calder's familiar grip, steady, firm, lingered just a beat too long, the casual warmth of it unnerving. And the smile he gave her. I hadn't seen him look at someone like that in years, maybe never. For a split second, I couldn't react. My mind tried to process everything at once. The polished ease of their familiarity, the way they moved like a unit, not two individuals thrown together for a meeting. Maybe it's innocent, some naive part of me whispered, but the truth hit just as fast. The sickening, awful realization twisted in my gut. Calder knew. He had to know about Cale. About everything. And this vivid display in front of me, this was his response, his quiet and calculated revenge. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my face neutral, but I knew I gave something away when I caught the slight tilt of Calder's mouth, like he was satisfied, pleased even, by my silent unraveling. My hands felt cold, suddenly useless, just resting on my lap as Seraphine took the seat beside Calder. He motioned for her to join, as if that hadn't been the plan all along. Every part of this was orchestrated, deliberate. And what could I do but sit there, caught in the trap he'd so carefully laid? They talked. About work, about clients I'd never heard of, projects that were foreign to me. She laughed at his jokes, his dry, cold jokes that had never once made me smile. And yet with her, they landed effortlessly. He would glance at her every now and then, with what could only be described as admiration, and it twisted something sharp inside me. It was a full-blown spectacle now, far beyond the dinner I thought I'd been invited to. I tried to busy myself with the plate in front of me, but the food tasted like ash. My thoughts were far from the table, back to Cale's garage, the lingering scent of motor oil on his neck, the way his touch had felt real in a time when everything else in my life felt muted. But the reality of Cale was no comfort anymore. Here, tonight, I was facing my husband's calm, absolute knowing. Seraphine's tone was light, her eyes catching Calder's as if they were sharing some inside secret, some joke I wasn't in on. I felt like an outsider at my own table, and Calder, with that careful distance he'd perfected over the years, played his part to the hilt. His cold indifference now held a new edge. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was a choice, and Seraphine embodied that choice. When dinner finally ended, I couldn't remember anything we had eaten. Calder didn't press me to speak, didn't try to engage me beyond the surface pleasantries. Seraphine left them to us, keeping her role perfectly discreet, while somehow always present, always near. From that night on, Calder didn't need to say a word about what had happened between Cale and me. He didn't have to accuse, to throw anything in my face. He simply acted. Seraphine became a fixture, always by his side at events, dinners, or even the casual business meeting over coffee. Slowly, but unmistakably, he stopped inviting me to come along. At first, it was subtle, and then, not so much. Alicia can't make it. Alicia's feeling unwell. Each time felt like a deliberate reminder that he'd moved on without me, that whatever constituted our marriage was now an empty page in a book we both stopped reading a long time ago. At home, he maintained a chilling civility. He was polite, formal even, in that way only Calder could manage, but the warmth was gone. He made no attempt to invite any closeness, no casual touches or brief moments of connection like they used to be. I had cheated on my husband, but instead of reacting with rage or betrayal, he grew freer. The more time passed, the clearer it became. My actions hadn't hurt him. They'd unshackled him. We shared dinners in silence. It was weird how Cale started pulling back. At first I chalked it up to stress. Too many hours at the shop, maybe. But there was something else. Something heavier weighing down on him. The past few times I visited, he was different. Distant. Cold, even. He stopped meeting me with that easy smile, started cutting our conversations short, his hands slower to reach for me. For weeks. That garage had been the only place I felt anything close to alive. being with him, it made the hollow spaces inside me feel filled, even if it was temporary. But lately, when I looked into his green eyes, I saw something shutting off, drifting. One night, I couldn't help it. I brought up Calder and Seraphine, said the words out loud like they might somehow fix what was wrong between us. I told him how Calder had all but thrown his new friendship with Seraphine in my face, how he was practically parading her around. A low blow, I thought, using her to hurt me now that things were out in the open. But Cale just stood there, wiping his hands on an old rag, his jaw tight, staring at the floor. He finally spoke, the words almost too quiet, like he didn't even want to hear them. Maybe it's time we stop. The way he said it, like he'd rehearsed it 100 times, hit harder than I thought it would. My breath caught in my throat. He wouldn't even look at me, as if none of what we'd done mattered anymore. My mind raced, grasping for any reason to make him take it back, to make him see how impossible stopping would be. But the weight in his voice, he was done. I felt this cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. No more excuses about the car, no more lingering glances that made me feel anything. Now, what? My entire world felt like it was spinning out of my control. But maybe part of me knew this was going to happen. You can't keep sneaking around forever without something giving way. Still, standing there staring at the back of his head, I wasn't ready for him to be the one to rip the last thread. I wanted to tell him that I needed him, that without him I had nothing left worth holding on to. But my voice was gone. The garage pressed in on me, the air too thick, the smell of oil and metal suddenly unbearable. I turned and left. Without another word, just walking out, feeling more hollow than I had in years. That was weeks ago now, and Calder's life with Seraphine has become some kind of grotesque art show I have to watch. He invited her to another one of his events, making sure everyone saw them arrive together, their hands brushing in that casual, too familiar way. Every time they entered a room, eyes followed them like moths to a flame, captivated by how perfect they seemed. There was this warmth between them, one that Calder never showed to me, not even when we were newlyweds, before everything had become so scripted with him. And Seraphine, she was good at all of it, laughing at the right moments, complimenting people effortlessly, flashing that bright smile that softened all the edges. I never liked these gatherings, hated playing the trophy wife next to Calder's polished demeanor. But watching him with her there, it was worse than just being ignored. It was like I didn't exist at all. I stood in the corner during the last event, sipping wine but tasting nothing. I could feel my skin prickling under all their glances. The whispers about how quickly Calder's moved on weren't subtle, and why would they be? He wasn't hiding it. He had her on his arm, her hand resting lightly on his back as they navigated the crowd. She knew exactly how to play it. Not too overt, just enough to let everyone know something had shifted. My stomach churned as I watched them. The way he smiled down at her, so uncharacteristically soft. For the first time in our marriage, I saw what Calder could be like when he wasn't so damn guarded. I felt like an outsider in my own life, and maybe the worst part, he didn't even seem angry about what had happened between me and Cale. If anything, it felt like he had shed some invisible burden, like he was finally free now. Now I'm left with the wreckage, literally. The house feels even larger, colder, and more suffocating than ever. Calder's rarely home these days. He leaves early and comes back late, and when he does, it's with this air of detachment, as if we're just two strangers cohabiting a space. There's no more hiding behind Cale either. No stolen moments to distract me anymore. No excuses to leave the house on a whim. I haven't seen him since that night, and I know better than to go chasing after him. He made his decision, and deep down I can't blame him for it. Months had passed since everything started to unravel, but tonight, standing at the community gala, it felt like the end was still mercilessly stretching on. The hall was packed with people in swanky evening wear, polished, grinning faces, hiding whatever realness lived underneath their pleasantries. I found myself tucked in a corner, clutching some half-finished glass of champagne like it had bolted me to the ground, pretending for the 100th time that I wanted to be here. And that was when I saw them, Calder and Seraphine. Of course, they were across the room, glowing in that effortless way that made everything about them seem natural, perfect even. Seraphine had this way of lighting up the space around her, like she belonged on display, and Calder, well, Calder stood beside her with an ease that scraped at whatever was left of me. He nodded my way, acknowledging my existence. But it was what came after, the way he turned back to her, his expression softening, the conversation flowing back like I hadn't even interrupted anything. That nod twisted something deep inside, a cold reminder that I'd become no more than a formality, nothing significant enough for thought. I barely managed to stay rooted to the spot, every fiber of me tightening, fighting the urge to just disappear through the nearest door. The rest of the evening? It became a blur of plastered-on smiles and autopilot responses. Conversation buzzed around me, but I wasn't hearing it. Or maybe I was, and that was the problem. Hushed murmurs lingered at the edge of every interaction. There was always chatter in this town, especially at events like these, where the line between charity and spectacle was paper thin. And now I was the star of it. I heard my name slip out of the mouth of some woman in a too-tight dress near the bar. "Did you hear about her and Cale?" I couldn't swallow my drink fast enough to keep the bile from rising. Another voice, lower, maybe a husband half-intested, half-bored, but roped into the drama, "And Calder's with her now, huh?" The air felt thicker. My stomach churned, twisting into knots. Every breath dragged. I caught someone else watching me from the corner of the room, a fleeting smirk curving their lips before they ducked behind a glass, pretending they hadn't seen me. They never said anything directly, but they didn't have to. I was a messy tale for them, something salacious to whisper over brunch and Botox appointments. The whispers? Hell, they weren't even whispers anymore, not really. Made me want to evaporate. There was no warmth left in this place, in these people. The same ones I'd smiled at, shared dinners and polite conversations with, now tearing me apart in bits. They didn't care about the complexities of my life. To them it was simple. I had it good, Calder. The house, a seemingly perfect life, and I wrecked it all. Because of Cale. It almost jolted me, that word in my mind. Cale. I hadn't been able to face it for so long. How I'd let it all slip into madness, justifying every visit to his garage. Until we crossed a line, so blurred, we couldn't see edge from center. Now we hadn't seen each other for weeks, and the last conversation still played in my head like a never-ending loop. How Cale had pulled away, as if he'd been suffocating, telling me it was over, like flipping off a light that should have been off since the start. At the time I hadn't known what to say. I just left. I always thought I had time to figure it out, but now I knew better. The funny thing was, it wasn't fury or even heartbreak that shattered me in the end. It was Calder's indifference. That was what carved me hollow, piece by piece. When we still had dinners, it was nothing but silence and clinking forks. He'd sit across from me like a stranger in our damn house, while I pretended to occupy a space I no longer belonged in. He never blamed me for anything outright, but his withdrawal carried more weight than words ever could. I'd find myself wondering what would have been easier, a screaming match to end it, or this cold, dissolving nothingness that made me feel like a ghost living in his world. Seraphine laughed at something across the room, her hand brushing Calder's sleeve, and I caught how he leaned in, his shoulders loosening, like they hadn't in years with me. People around them moved in close, orbiting as if they could soak up some of whatever that was, whatever made Calder want to stay present. It took everything I had not to shove my chair back and leave right then, but I stayed planted, letting the sight of him with her, younger, lively, untouched by the heavy history I now carried, suffocate me. I felt it more acutely when someone brushed too close to my arm, like they didn't notice I was there at all. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. I took a gulp of my drink. The champagne had long gone flat, dull, barely more than a trickle of bitterness sliding down my throat. Fitting. Outside of this place, the town wasn't much different than the room I was trapped in tonight. Everywhere I went now, eyes followed. I couldn't walk into a cafe or grocery store without seeing someone lean in and whisper, or hear snatches of stories half concealed behind raised, flagrant eyebrows. Poor thing. Desperate. Ruined her own damn life. None of them knew a thing, and none of it mattered. I hurried home after the gala, needing the dark quiet of the house like a balm. The usual emptiness greeted me when I stepped inside, the air heavy from disuse, like it was frozen in time, since Calder had all but moved on. Alone, I made my way upstairs, heels discarded halfway down the hall before I stopped in front of the mirror. The reflection caught me off guard. I knew it was still me, but at the same time it wasn't. The face that stared back was tired, eyes dulled, skin stretched too tight from all the nights I spent looking at ceilings instead of sleeping. I leaned closer, studying the lines, the tiredness in my gaze, and somewhere in it all, I felt like I was looking at a stranger who'd made every wrong decision. The woman in the mirror had thrown away years of quiet stability. For what? A fling? A brief escape? The reality was simple. Cale was never what I thought he was. Calder, for all his faults, was right to move on. I stood at the edge of my life's wreckage, left to face it while Calder, no longer burdened by me, thrived. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe, and comment on the video for more stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have any similar stories to share, leave them in the comments and we'll make sure to bring them to life. Thanks for watching.